I'm going to give you some brief background. I've suffered with mental health since I was probably 11 or 12, maybe younger. Wasn't diagnosed until I was 27. I have an extensive criminal record and I've been to prison. I'm an ex-drug addict. I have also worked in drug rehabilitation. I've worked as a consultant for the police, both in training police officers and developing policy, as well as working with rehabilitation of offenders, the rehabilitation of offenders programs. I've worked as an independent consultant for social services, and I've also worked with family courts. My two other areas that I've worked in are heavy engineering, diesel fitting, and IT. I used to develop web security systems for central and local government in factor authentication and various other web-based protocols. I'm telling you this because I've been at both ends of the spectrum. One of the things I did when I was in prison was use my time as effectively as I possibly could. I read the Quran and I spent 18 months studying Islam. I looked into Hinduism, I looked into Sikhism, I looked into Buddhism, I looked into the Jewish faith, and I looked back at my own Christian faith. 50% of this was out of general interest. 50% of it was I was at a point in my life where I needed something, some guidance. And I thought maybe religion would be that guidance I was looking for. Please excuse Benji in the background. I'm going to tag a few people in this because I genuinely want your opinions and responses to what I'm about to say. I think we have a major problem in our country right now. We have a divide that goes way beyond a bullshit European referendum that really, in the grand scheme of things, when we look at the problems that are facing the world and that our children are growing up in, means fuck all, means nothing. But it's shown a division, and we also have a division within the Muslim community to a degree, globally, between Sunnis and Shias. Then we have an issue in this country particularly that Islam is under a certain level of attack. Now we can argue morally whether that attack is justifiable. But my concern is, and why I genuinely want people's opinions is, when we have somebody like Anjem Choudary, who is one of the most dangerous and vitriolic Islamic preachers in this country currently, preaching his desire for Sharia law to be implemented in the UK, for his opinions that a homosexual should be stoned to death for wanting to share his life with another man, or to take a woman who was forced to marry a man she never loved, then stone her to death for having a relationship with a man that she did. Now, in my world, there's no place for that. But the point is, for me, I would sacrifice my liberty in a heartbeat to defend Anjem Chowdary's right to say that, to preach his poisonous rhetoric. I would absolutely sacrifice my liberty time and time and time again for his right to stand there and say this shit. Because his right to free speech means more to me than the bullshit that he's coming out with. But in the same way, I would fight and sacrifice my liberty for the likes of Tommy Robinson to be able to have his opinion. Now, it doesn't matter whether we agree with these people. It actually highlights a bigger problem, that we don't have equality in this country. There was a situation a few years ago where third and fourth generation Indian Muslims, teenagers, ranging from kind of 17, 18 to their early 20s, protested at the cenotaph, burning black poppies, and again preaching some pretty questionable content, quite frankly, that I found offensive. What was funny about this actually was that they were protesting a symbol that represented the sacrifice for them to have that free speech. You know, they were too stupid to realise that. Maybe that was their intention. My biggest concern was the lack of national uproar. What concerns me is the liberalist media to avoid the protests of the repatriation of dead soldiers and their families being spat at by allegedly moderate Muslims. There was one quite famous picture of a Muslim lady in her late 50s spitting at the mother of a dead soldier. Yeah, the image got buried, and you'd be hard pressed to find it. I'm not going to post. I've got a copy. I'm not going to post it because I don't think reopening that wound is helpful. But as a social experiment, please see if you can find it. The mainstream media didn't cover that story. There was no national outrage. But what I do see, and for me, this is about our freedoms and the sacrifice that was made for those freedoms. That although I despise what Anjan Chowdhury stands for, in a similar way that I despise what the far right stands for. And I'm not saying for 1 second that Tommy Robinson's far right. He's not. He's a working class guy that has seen awful things happen in his town, and the fact that the authorities were too frightened to deal with it. For 10 years he was saying that, and people laughed at him and tried to silence him and mocked him and called him a racist. Now, I've been quite interested in this guy. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt and actually let's have a look at what he's saying. And I'm really struggling to find anything that makes him overtly a racist. Islamophobic, absolutely, no doubt. But when you consider the context of what he's grown up in, can you blame him? You know, the most famous case at the minute is Rotherham. And through my social care background, I know where 2 or 3 of the victims are. One of them's currently is in a secure unit, a secure psychiatric unit, not too far from where I live. You don't end up in a secure psychiatric unit if you are not incredibly, incredibly damaged. I've been lucky enough to have a message conversation with the mother of another of the victims, who I'm not going to name for obvious reasons. I'm not going to tell you what she does for a living, but what I will say is she has a very, very much middle class occupation, as does her husband. They live in a very middle class, I want to say typically white area, but it is. It's not beat around the bush. Let's be frightened of saying this. They live in a very white area. And on the limited conversation and context you can have via email and instant message, you know, her daughter will never recover from this. And then when you have senior police officers, Benji, when you have senior police officers and senior council members who actually openly admitted in public, Benji, shush, enough, openly admitted to making statements that were incredibly offensive to those families. Benji! Shut up! Which were incredibly offensive to those families. And they actively, you know, a senior police officer said, we were made aware of the situation, but we had to make a judgment call on what was best for the community of Rotherham. Which is just a polite way of saying we didn't want to be called fucking racists and we didn't want to offend the Muslim community. So in that moment, the gang rape of a 13-year-old child became less important than a political response. The duty of care to that child was lost because of equality and diversity. That's a fictitious thing that doesn't actually exist, which is why I mentioned the Anjan Chowdhury, Tommy Robinson, because these two guys are treated completely differently. Yeah, I would fight for their right to free speech in the same way that I would do whatever I could to make 1% of those victims' lives better from Rotherham. But don't fall into the trap that it was just Rotherham. It wasn't just Rotherham. It's happening in Derby, it's happening in Nottingham, it's happening in Leicester, it's happening in Bristol, it's happening in Luton, it's happening in Exeter. It's happening in Stockport, it's happening in Sunderland, it's happening everywhere. We need to grow some balls and stop being frightened about being called racists. Anybody who watches this is ignorant, stupid enough, or lazy enough to think that this is about race. Go fuck yourselves. Because it isn't. But we have to deal with this situation. We have to work with the communities involved. Thousands and thousands and thousands of children have been gang raped by Pakistani Muslim gangs. And I'm going to ask a tough question. If this was white gangs targeting Muslim children, how would the liberal left media react? How would we react as a nation? We'd be fucking horrified. And I'd be the first person on my streets, if it was in my town, looking for them. I'm very passionate about the Second World War. From a general interest point of view, but the politics fascinates me. I don't want to make the same mistakes. I don't want us to make the same mistakes, but I think we are. We are allowing division to separate us. We're allowing political correctness from stopping us from the ability to say what we want to say out of fear of some ignorant liberal leftist twat calling you a racist. There's a problem within the Muslim Pakistani community with their ideology and how white women are represented within that ideology. And the ridiculous thing is, one of my closest friends is Muslim. He comes from a very conservative Muslim background. He doesn't practice his Islamic faith with his children. He wants them to have that choice when they're old enough. I've mentioned him in a couple of other videos. He's a great. He's very anti-Islam at the minute, because what he says to me, he says, you know what, I see it in my community all the time. All these Muslims claiming that they're moderate and they're not conservative and they want to integrate. And he said, you know what, in the community, in the wider public, they say that. Of course they do. He said, you know what, the minute the door's shut, the vast majority, that moderation disappears. And part of that is, you know, the Muslim community are very judgmental within each other, you know, and status is very important, and, you know, children going to university and what university to get into, the status is incredibly important, probably far more important than it is in the white British kind of sense. I'm trying to be very, even me, I'm being really careful in what I'm trying to say. I don't want to make these distinctions, but they are there, let's not ignore it. But my point is, we have to police the PC brigade and say that no, rape of a child is completely unfucking acceptable, and to brush it under the carpet, to actually attempt to cover it up, which is what the police and Rotherham Council did, because of the risk of being frightened of being called a racist and the damage it may have done to diversity and community cohesion. That's bollocks. Because I know I can walk out my door and I can go into Loughborough and I can introduce you to 101 Muslims who are lovely people, who are just as disgusted, just as horrified, and are just as offended that the authorities felt that this was an appropriate reaction. So it isn't about damaging community cohesion. This is about, we've got to a point where political correctness has gone fucking nuts. Got that bad that we will sacrifice gang raping of children. If I'm wrong, or I'm misinterpreting this, then let me know. But I'd really like to know what people's opinions are on what I've just said. Like I say, fundamentally, this is about free speech, and I will defend the poison of Andrew Chowdhury and the likes of the EDL with equal ferocity, and I would sacrifice my liberty for both those sides, because free speech is far more important to me than political correctness. It's far more important than the liberal lazy left accusing people of being racist without actually thinking, you know what, your tactics may be questionable, but your agenda may be right. And this problem was in Luton 15 years ago, and a group of people got together and said they weren't happy about this. Their approach may not suit the stomachs of everybody, but their motives were probably genuine. Thanks for watching, guys.